Before the sun cleared the hills of Galilee on the morning of September 3rd, the valley was already awake. Mist clung to the low ground like a burial shroud, pooling between the olive groves and the pale limestone ridges that flanked the Jezreel Valley from east to west. The air smelled of dry grass and horse sweat, and something older, the particular mineral sharpness of ancient ground that has absorbed 10,000 years of rain and blood. A thin stream wound through the valley floor, catching the first grey light of dawn, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a water bird startled into flight. The locals called it Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, a place where, according to scripture, a shepherd boy had once walked into a valley to face an impossible giant, and walked out the other side carrying the giant's head. The Mongols arrived from the north like a river that had forgotten its banks. They came in columns of mail and leather and lacquered bone, their compact horses moving with the low, ground-eating stride of animals bred for nothing but war. Kettle drums pulsed at the head of each formation. Pennants snapped in the morning wind. These were not raiders or irregulars. These were the veterans of Baghdad and Aleppo and Damascus, men who had watched the greatest city in the world burn for a week and had felt nothing except the satisfaction of a job completed. They numbered somewhere between 10 and 20,000, precise counts lost to the fog of medieval record-keeping. But what mattered was not their number. What mattered was what they represented, what they had already done, what no force on earth had yet been able to stop them from doing. Facing them, drawn up in the shadow of the eastern ridgeline, was an army of slaves. Not metaphorical slaves. Not men who had once been enslaved and now wore the borrowed dignity of freedom. These were the Mamluks, the purchased warriors of Egypt, men bought as boys from the steppes of the Black Sea, from the mountain valleys of the Caucasus, from the wreckage of peoples the Mongol expansion had already shattered. They had been trained since childhood in the art of mounted warfare. They could shoot a composite bow at full gallop, reload in 3 seconds, and hit a target at 150 yards. Their horses wore iron shoes on ground that tore apart the hooves of Mongol ponies. And they were led by 2 men who hated each other almost as much as they hated the enemy now descending toward them. A sultan named Qutuz, who had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment, and a general named Baibars, who had spent his entire life preparing for it without knowing it. Here is what the history books will tell you about Ain Jalut: that it was the first battle the Mongols ever truly lost, the moment their westward march across the known world hit a wall and stopped. That it saved Egypt, and through Egypt the remaining heartlands of Islam. That it preserved a corridor of civilization between Central Asia and the Mediterranean that might otherwise have been swept clean. Here is what the history books will not always tell you: that the weapon that stopped the Mongol Empire was not a general, not a strategy, not a terrain advantage, though all 3 played their part. The secret weapon was something stranger and darker and more poetic than any of that. And by the time this story ends, you will understand exactly why the most unstoppable military force in human history was finally, permanently stopped by the very people it had created. This battle changed the world forever. This is the shocking truth of Ain Jalut. To understand why September 3rd, 1260 mattered, you need to understand what the world looked like in the decades before it, and that picture is not comfortable to sit with. Genghis Khan had died in 1227, after spending roughly 2 decades building the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. His successors did not slow down, they accelerated. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the plains of Poland, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the sweltering lowlands of Persia. They had shattered the Jin dynasty. They had dismantled the Khwarezmian Empire in a campaign of such methodical brutality that entire cities ceased to exist. Not conquered, not occupied, but erased. The populations of Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, cities that had been centers of culture and commerce for centuries, were reduced to scattered bones in empty streets. Contemporary chroniclers, not prone to exaggeration, estimated the dead in the millions. Modern historians argue about the exact figures, but no serious scholar disputes the scale. The Mongol conquests of the early and middle 13th century represent one of the most catastrophic demographic events in recorded human history. And they kept moving. What made the Mongols so terrifying was not just their violence. History is full of violent armies. What made them nearly impossible to stop was the combination of mobility, tactical sophistication, and psychological warfare that they had refined over generations of steppe conflict. Their basic tactical unit was the two-men, 10,000 horsemen, divided and subdivided into units of thousands, hundreds, and tens, each level of command capable of independent action. They communicated across vast distances using signal flags and relay riders. They could cover 60 miles in a single day when necessary. They gathered intelligence obsessively, sending spies and diplomats ahead of their armies to map roads, catalogue fortifications, and identify potential collaborators among the populations they intended to conquer. They offered every enemy the same choice: submit and be incorporated, resist and be annihilated. And they made sure the annihilations were thorough enough that the word spread faster than their armies. By the time a Mongol army arrived at your city walls, you already knew what had happened to every city that had resisted before you. That was the point. Terror was logistics. Terror saved arrows and time. In 1251, Monk Khan became Great Khan and immediately set about implementing his grandfather's dream of global empire. He sent one brother, Kublai, east against China. He sent another brother, Hulagu, west. Hulagu's assignment was specific: destroy the assassins, subordinate the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, and continue west until the ocean stopped him. He was given 1/5 of the entire Mongol Empire's military manpower for this task, somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men, depending on which source you trust, and a corps of Chinese siege engineers who had spent decades perfecting the art of bringing down walls. No city was expected to resist. None of them, in the end, did. Then came Baghdad. Baghdad in 1258 was not merely a city. It was the center of the Islamic world, political, cultural, spiritual, and intellectual, in a way that has no modern equivalent. Since the 8th century, it had been the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the institution that provided Sunni Islam with its recognized spiritual authority. At the height of its power, it had been the largest city on earth, home to over 1 million people. A place where scholars from every corner of the known world came to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature, in the great library complex known as the House of Wisdom. Its political power had waned in the centuries before 1258, but its symbolic weight remained immense. The Caliph was not a general. He was a symbol, the living link between the Prophet's community and the present, the man whose name was spoken in prayers from Morocco to Central Asia every single Friday. Hulagu gave the Caliph al-Mustasim the standard Mongol offer: submit, pay tribute, provide soldiers. Al-Mustasim, trusting in Baghdad's sacred status and in diplomats' assurances that no conqueror would dare destroy the seat of the caliphate, refused. His vizier may have been a traitor. His generals were inadequate. His walls, damaged by years of floods, were not what they once had been. On January 29, 1258, Hulagu's army surrounded the city on all sides. The siege lasted 12 days. On February 10th, Baghdad surrendered. What followed lasted a week, and it changed the Islamic world's psychology in ways that had not fully healed by the time our story reaches its climax. The Mongols looted systematically: wealth, art, manuscripts, everything of value that could be moved. Then they killed. Contemporary estimates range from 200,000 to 800,000 dead. The Tigris River, according to chroniclers who may have been writing with poetic license but were describing a real catastrophe, ran black with ink from the destroyed manuscripts of the House of Wisdom, then red with blood. The greatest library in the world became ash. The greatest city in the world became a ghost. And the Caliph, the spiritual head of Sunni Islam, the man whose authority connected a billion prayers to a single center, was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, because Mongol custom prohibited the spilling of royal blood directly on the earth. After Baghdad, resistance became psychologically almost impossible. If the caliphate itself could not stop them, what could? Aleppo fell in January 1260. Damascus opened its gates in March, the Ayyubid prince who ruled there choosing submission over the fate of Baghdad. By spring, Mongol outriders had reached the shores of the Mediterranean. All of Syria was under Mongol control or Mongol influence. The next logical step was Egypt. Hulagu sent his ultimatum to Cairo. The letter, as recorded by medieval historians, was not subtle. It described what had happened to Baghdad in detail. It enumerated the kingdoms that had already submitted. It advised the Mamluk Sultan, a man named Saif ad-Din Qutuz, to consider his options carefully and make the correct decision. The letter's final lines were reportedly pure Mongol poetry. The earth trembles at our tread. Prayers avail nothing. Your God has abandoned you. Your time is up. Qutuz gathered his council. The legal scholars debated. A surrender faction argued the pragmatic case. Better to submit and survive than resist and face Baghdad's fate. Qutuz listened. Then he had the Mongol envoys seized, taken to the Bab Zuwayla gate of Cairo, and publicly beheaded. Their heads were mounted on spikes above the gate, and left there, looking north, in the direction from which the army they represented would now inevitably come. It was an act of either extraordinary courage or extraordinary desperation. And in the weeks that followed, Qutuz himself may not have been entirely sure which. But he was not alone, because in the camps outside Cairo, sharpening his sword and watching the political manoeuvring with the cold, calculating patience of a man who had been bought and sold and survived everything the world had thrown at him, was Baibars. Born on the Kipchak steppe, captured by Mongol raiders as a boy, sold through the slave markets of Anatolia, purchased eventually by the Ayyubid sultans of Egypt, trained from adolescence in the military arts that the Mamluk system perfected. He had already been tested in the field against the Seventh Crusade. It was Baibars who had crushed King Louis IX of France at Mansoura in 1250, a battle that ended a crusade and began a legend. He had been exiled. He had been a mercenary. He had fought in Syria for Ayyubid princes who couldn't hold their thrones. When Kutuz sent word that the Baria regiment was welcome back in Egypt because the Mongols were coming and every sword was needed, Baibars returned. Kutuz needed Baibars because Baibars was the best field commander alive. Baibars needed Kutuz because Kutuz had the throne and Baibars wanted it. Both men knew this. Neither man said it aloud, and together, warily, watchfully, with the particular tension of two predators who need each other to bring down larger prey, they began to prepare for the battle that would decide everything. The army left Cairo in late July of 1260, 25,000 men in some estimates, perhaps more. A force built from the core Mamluk regiments, supplemented by auxiliary infantry, Syrian volunteers, and former Mongol soldiers who had defected to Mamluk service after earlier defeats. They marched north and east, through the Sinai and into Palestine, moving with the deliberate speed of an army that knew exactly where it was going and exactly why. The first decision that shaped everything else was the choice of battlefield. Baibars had operated as a fugitive and mercenary in Palestine for years before his return to Egypt. He knew the roads, the water sources, the places where the land narrowed and the places where it opened. He knew the Jezreel Valley the way a soldier knows the ground he has crossed on foot, not from maps, not from reports, but from memory. From the particular knowledge of a man who has slept on its rocks and drunk from its streams. When the strategic question was posed, where do we meet them, if we meet them at all, Baibars had an answer. The Jezreel Valley was approximately 25 miles long and between 5 and 8 miles wide, running roughly northwest to southeast through the lower Galilee region. Its northern edge was bounded by the Nazareth Ridge. Its southern boundary was the hills of Samaria. The valley floor was flat enough for cavalry maneuver, but not so wide that an army could simply fan out infinitely. More importantly, the valley's eastern approach, the direction from which any Mongol force moving south from Syria would arrive, passed through a natural constriction where the land rose on both sides, forcing any army moving through it into a relatively narrow column before the valley opened up. The heights on either side of this approach were covered with scrub brush and shallow gullies, the kind of terrain where a man lying still in the early morning shadows was effectively invisible from the valley floor below. The spring itself, Ain Jalut, sat near this constriction. It was the only reliable water source for miles in any direction. Any army marching south from Damascus needed to stop there. Any commander who controlled the high ground around that spring controlled the battle before it began. Baibars chose Ain Jalut. Kutuz agreed. They moved their forces into position in the last days of August, occupying the ridgelines and the scrub-covered slopes with the bulk of the army, the flanking force that would only reveal itself when the moment was precisely right. A forward element, several thousand strong, visible and deliberately provocative, was positioned in the valley itself. These men were the bait. They knew they were the bait. They rode out that last evening before the engagement, knowing that the next day they would be charged by the greatest cavalry force in the world, and they would have to run, believably, convincingly, not too fast and not too slow, in the exact direction that brought the Mongols into the trap. There is also the question of the weapons. Medieval Arabic military treatises, some of them written within living memory of the battle and based on accounts from participants, describe the Mamluks deploying something at Ain Jalut that the Mongols had never encountered before. A device that combined fire and a thunderous report, that could be carried and aimed by a single soldier. The historian Ahmad Youssef al-Hassan, examining these 14th century manuscripts, argues that they describe a functional hand cannon, a metal tube packed with an explosive charge capable of projecting a projectile at devastating speed and, more immediately relevant at Ain Jalut, producing a crack of sound and a flash of fire that caused horses not trained to endure it to bolt uncontrollably. Whether this constitutes the first battlefield use of a true firearm in history is debated. Other historians argue the Mongols themselves brought gunpowder west from China, and that Arab knowledge of it derived from Mongol contact. But the debate itself is revealing. Something was used at Ain Jalut that appeared in the record as new, as startling, as part of what made this battle different from all the engagements that came before it. The Mongol horses had never heard that sound in battle. That fact would matter. Beyond the possible firearms, the Mamluks held several advantages that their commanders understood clearly. Their horses were shod with iron, standard practice in the Egyptian military, and Syria's rocky terrain was brutal on the unshod hooves of Mongol ponies, which were bred for the open grassland of the steppe. Over the weeks of campaigning, Mongol horses operating in rocky Syria would have been working on increasingly damaged feet, reducing their speed and agility. The Mamluk composite bow, while similar in basic design to the Mongol bow, was optimized for their style of fighting. Heavy cavalry that could absorb punishment as well as deliver it, rather than the Mongol preference for shooting from maximum distance and refusing close engagement. And the Mamluk soldiers wore proper metal armour, lamellar cuirasses of iron or hardened leather, mail hauberks, iron helmets with chain aventails, that could stop an arrow at range in a way that the lighter Mongol leather protection could not. On the Mongol side, the situation was less favourable than it appeared. Kitbuqa Noyan, the commander left in charge when Hulagu withdrew north, was experienced and competent and utterly confident. A confidence that was entirely justified by his personal military history and entirely unjustified by the situation he was walking into. He commanded somewhere between 10 and 20,000 men, a fraction of the force that had taken Baghdad and Damascus. He was far from his supply lines, operating in terrain that his cavalry was not designed for, against an enemy he probably considered beneath his contempt. The Mamluk force was, after all, made up of men from the same steppe cultures that the Mongols had conquered, Turkic slaves, defeated peoples. In Kitbuqa's framework, they were already beaten. The battle was just paperwork. On the night before September 3rd, the Jezreel Valley was quiet, in the way that only a valley containing 30 or 40,000 armed men can be quiet, which is to say, not quiet at all if you listened carefully, but quiet in the way that mattered, the deep organizational silence of armies waiting for permission to begin. Along the ridgelines and behind the scrub, Mamluk soldiers prayed. The Quran was recited in low voices, the particular passages that soldiers recite before battle, the verses about patience and steadfastness, and the promise that those who die in God's cause are not truly dead. Men checked their bowstrings for the last time, pulling them back slowly, feeling for any sign of fraying. They checked their horses' hooves, their saddle straps, the leather loops that secured their swords and maces to their persons. Some of them had been children when the Mongols came through their homelands. Some of them had relatives in the rubble of Baghdad. Some of them had watched, from a distance, as cities they had known surrendered and burned. For these men, the morning that was coming was not purely a military operation. It was something older, something personal. Baibars did not sleep. He was on horseback before midnight, moving along the ridgeline in near total darkness, pausing at each position to exchange a few words with the commanders stationed there, checking angles of attack, recalculating distances, rememorizing the topography he already knew by heart. He was a man constitutionally incapable of leaving anything to chance, when the alternative was thorough preparation. And so he prepared. And prepared. And prepared. Qutuz sat alone. Later accounts describe him on the night before Ain Jalut as a man stripped of everything except the essential question: was this fight survivable? He had already made the choice that could not be unmade. The Mongol ambassadors' heads were 3 weeks old on the gates of Cairo. There was no surrender available to him, even if he wanted it. There was only the morning and what happened in it, and whether any of it was enough. The valley held its breath. The stars turned overhead, indifferent to the arrangements of men below them. The spring at Ain Jalut caught the light of a half-moon and threw it back in broken silver pieces. Somewhere in the darkness to the north, Kitbuqa's army slept. In a few hours, the sun would rise directly behind the Mamluk positions, flooding the valley from east to west, striking the Mongol advance directly in the eyes. Baibars had thought of everything. The sun broke the eastern hills at roughly 6 in the morning, and the Jezreel Valley went from grey to gold in the time it took to breathe. The Mongol advance guard came first, the Yazak, the screening cavalry that preceded any Mongol army on the move, trained to identify enemy positions and probe for weaknesses. They moved into the valley in loose formation, horses at a trot, eyes scanning the ridgelines. Amir Baidar, the Yazak commander, spotted the Mamluk forward element almost immediately. Several thousand cavalry, arrayed in the valley floor, their armour catching the morning light, sitting still and waiting. He sent a rider back to Kitbuqa. "There are Egyptians here, waiting." He requested instructions. Kitbuqa sent back, "Hold your position, I am coming." But Baidar did not hold his position. What happened next is one of the small pivots on which enormous histories turn. Whether Baidar acted out of impatience, out of professional contempt for the enemy force he was looking at, or out of the particular military arrogance that comes from never having lost, we do not know. What we know is that he ordered his Yazak forward. Thousands of Mongol cavalry, accelerating from trot to canter to a full charge, the drums picking up behind them, the pennants streaming, the sound of hoofbeats building from a distant rumble into something you felt in your chest cavity before you heard it with your ears. Baibars, watching from the ridge above, felt it coming, heard it coming, and turned his forward element and ran. Not panicked, not scattered. A disciplined withdrawal, the horses pulling back at an angle that preserved formation while still projecting exactly the visual signal that Baidar needed to see. An enemy that had looked at the Mongol charge and broken. Baibars' men dropped back toward the valley's middle section, moving just fast enough to stay ahead of the pursuit, just slow enough to keep the Mongols engaged, their rear riders occasionally turning to loose arrows back toward the advancing line. The ancient theatre of the feigned retreat performed with precision. Baidar's men came on hard, they always did. The retreat worked because the charge was irresistible. And the charge was irresistible because it had always worked before. Kitbuqa arrived to find his Yazak in full pursuit, streaming south into the valley, the Egyptian force running before them. He assessed the situation with the quick confidence of a man who had seen 1,000 variations of this exact picture. He ordered the main force forward. The valley swallowed them. The drums from the Mongol side grew louder as formation after formation poured south into the Jezreel, filling the flat ground between the ridgelines. a mass of horsemen that seemed from above to replace the morning mist with a moving, bristling, living thing. The horses tossed their heads. The men shouted back and forth across the formation in Mongolian and Turkic. Victory was in the air like a smell. They had been here before. This exact picture, an enemy running, the ground opening before them, the kill imminent. But the ground was not opening. It was narrowing. Baibars felt the moment approaching. He knew it the way a man who has studied a trap for weeks knows the exact instant the mechanism is about to trigger. He could hear the Mongol main force behind him. He could feel the valley walls compressing the pursuit into a tighter and tighter mass. The ridgelines on either side, dark and still and apparently empty, waited. He raised his signal banner. The sound came first. From the eastern ridge and from the western slope simultaneously, a noise that had no precedent in the experience of the Mongol army. A sharp, explosive crack, followed by a bloom of smoke and a flash of fire that seemed to emerge from the hillside itself. Then another. Then several at once, staggered, rolling down the ridgeline like a storm that had decided to start at the top of a hill and work its way down. The Mongol horses heard it. They had heard battle sounds before: drums, horns, the shriek of arrows, the clash of weapons. They had not heard this. The ones nearest the first discharge bucked and shied violently. The ones behind them, packed close in the valley's narrowed approach, slammed into the startled animals ahead. The formation that had been a flowing, deadly river became, in the space of 30 seconds, a compressed and confused mass of men fighting their own animals while trying to understand what was happening on the hillsides above them. Into that confusion, the Mamluk flanking forces descended. Thousands of cavalry pouring down both ridgelines at once. Heavy horses at full gallop, the riders shooting as they came. The composite bow, drawn and released at speed, the arrows flattening out over the valley floor in sheets rather than individual flights. The sound changed. The valley that had been full of Mongol confidence became full of something else. The clang of iron on iron, the particular high sound of arrows finding gaps between armor plates, the deeper, wetter sounds of close combat, the screaming of horses that is different from any other sound animals make. The Mongols were not helpless. They were never helpless. Even caught in a disadvantageous position, Kitbuqa's veterans were among the best individual fighters in the world, and they began immediately to reorganize. The smaller formations working to create space, the rear elements wheeling to protect the flanks, the discipline of the decimal system asserting itself even under pressure. They had been in ambushes before. They had escaped worse. For a few minutes, as the Mamluk flanking forces hit them and the melee spread across the valley floor, it looked like Mongol adaptability might rescue the situation yet. But the valley was doing its work. The terrain that Baibars had chosen was doing exactly what he had designed it to do. A Mongol army's central tactical doctrine depended on space and mobility. Their cavalry was most lethal at range, the mounted archer circling and shooting, maintaining distance, wearing down an enemy with arrow fire before closing for the kill. In the Jezreel Valley's narrowed approach section, packed with thousands of men who had poured in on the heels of the pursuit, there was no space. The horses couldn't maneuver. The archers couldn't get the angle they needed. The men trained to fight at range were suddenly in a knife fight. And the Mamluks who had ridden down from the ridgelines wore more armour, sat on heavier horses and carried curved swords designed for exactly this kind of close, brutal exchange. Baibars swung his forward element around. The men who had been running, who had performed the feigned retreat that brought the Mongols into the valley, reversed direction, and came back. Not running away now, coming back toward the men who had been chasing them, accelerating, drawing swords, the horses extending into full gallop, and the Mongols, who had been pursuing, suddenly found themselves caught between the force they had been chasing and the forces that had hit them from both sides. And the geometry of the situation completed itself. The hammer had found its anvil. By late morning, the battle had been raging for several hours. The initial shock of the ambush had settled into something more like a massive, grinding struggle across the valley floor, with the Mongols compressed into a disadvantageous position and the Mamluks methodically exploiting every angle. The Mongol formation was not broken, not yet. These were men who had conquered most of the known world, and they were fighting with everything they had. But the line between a battle you are losing and a battle you have lost is a thin one, and Kitbuqa's line was on the wrong side of it. Phase 3. The Betrayal. It was somewhere in the middle of the battle, when the outcome had not yet been decided, but the wind had clearly begun to shift, that the Syrian auxiliaries made their choice. The Syrian contingent in Kitbuqa's force was exactly what it looked like. Soldiers from the cities and towns that had submitted to Mongol rule when Aleppo and Damascus fell. Men who had been incorporated into the Mongol army out of necessity rather than loyalty. They were Muslims fighting under an Nestorian Christian general for a pagan empire against a Muslim army on Muslim ground. The theological arithmetic of that situation had never quite worked out, and as the morning wore on and the Mamluk momentum built and the Mongol formation began to show its first real signs of strain, the Syrians did what men in their position have done throughout military history when the math stops working. They switched sides. Not all at once. The defection rippled through the Syrian formations in sections, men peeling away from Mongol units and moving toward the Mamluk lines, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in larger formations. Kitbuqa saw it happening. His commanders saw it happening. And there was nothing, tactically, that could be done about it in the middle of an engagement that was already consuming all available attention. In a single movement, the Mongol numerical disadvantage became catastrophic. The Mongols lost perhaps a third of their effective force in the space of minutes, not to death, but to defection. A formation that had been holding its shape despite enormous pressure suddenly had gaps. Units that had been protecting flanks dissolved, and the Mamluks, who had been pressing hard on every side, felt the resistance change. Not collapse, change. A door that had required all your shoulder to hold suddenly requires nothing at all, and you stumble through it. Kutuz felt it. He was in the middle of the line, fighting personally. Accounts describe him as drawing his sword and riding directly into the thickest part of the combat at several points during the battle. The kind of frontline presence that was both militarily useful and symbolically indispensable when the army needed to see that its sultan was not watching from a safe distance. At the moment the Syrian defection completed itself and the Mongol line fractured, he did something that has been recorded by multiple contemporary sources. He pulled off his helmet, the iron helmet that marked him as the commander, the man behind the visored face that his soldiers were used to following, and threw it to the ground. And he cried out, in a voice that carried above the noise of the battle, in Arabic, 2 words: Wa Islama, for Islam. The sound of a man stripping himself of his protection and placing himself absolutely in the path of whatever was coming. It travels differently than orders, than commands, than tactical instructions. It is not information. It is something older. And the Mamluk army, men who had been raised in the consciousness of what had happened to Baghdad, Men who had heard the stories and smelled the smoke of a civilization burned to its foundations, responded to it the way such men always respond to the sound of absolute commitment. They surged forward. Phase 4. The death of Kitbuqa. Kitbuqa Noyan had been fighting since he was a boy. He had campaigned across 3 continents. He had stood in the ruins of Baghdad. He had watched nations surrender at the sight of Mongol banners. He had never, in his entire military life, seen a battle go like this one was going. But he did not retreat. He could not retreat. He was a Mongol commander, and Mongol commanders did not retreat without orders. And there were no orders coming, because the man who would have issued them had already gone back to Azerbaijan to deal with the succession crisis that Monka's death had created. Kitbuqa was alone in this valley, with a force that was shrinking by the minute, fighting an enemy that was fighting as if each individual man had something personally at stake in the outcome, which, being Mamluks, being the men that the Mongol expansion had created, being the soldiers who had seen Baghdad die, each individual man did. The Mamluk cavalry closed around him, not in disorder. This was not a mob. This was an organized, professional encirclement, the kind that Mamluk training specifically prepared for. The heavy horses formed a moving perimeter, tightening. The archers kept up a constant fire from the edges, not trying to break through, but maintaining pressure, keeping the remaining Mongol force in contact, preventing any organized breakout. And at the center of the shrinking circle, Kitbuqa kept fighting. How he died exactly depends on which source you trust. Some accounts say he was killed in combat, cut down by Mamluk cavalry in the final press of the encirclement. Others say he was taken alive, brought before Qutuz with his hands bound, and executed on the battlefield. The most detailed accounts favor the second version, and they preserve a fragment of reported speech that has come down through the historical record in several independent versions, which suggests it carries at least some echo of what was actually said. He stood before Qutuz, hands bound, and he spoke. "Do not take pride in this day," he said. "If I am killed by your hand, consider it God's act. But do not be deceived by this victory for even a moment. When the news of my death reaches Hulagu Khan, the ocean of his wrath will boil over. From Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt will shake with the sound of Mongol hooves." Qutuz listened to this. Then he gave the order. Kitbuqa died in the Jezreel Valley on September 3rd, 1260, and with him died the last Mongol claim to invincibility. The Mongol formation broke. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a fighting retreat conducted in good order to preserve the force for another day. A rout. The particular kind of disintegration that happens when a military formation passes the point where discipline can hold it together. When individual survival instinct overrides collective training. When the men who are still standing look around and understand that the men who were standing next to them 5 minutes ago are not standing anymore. And there is nothing left to do except run. They ran north, toward Bisan, 8 miles away, back the way they had come, back towards Syria and the supply lines, and the idea that somewhere to the north there was still an intact Mongol world they could return to. Qutuz did not let them go. He sent the cavalry after them immediately, Baibars at the front of the pursuit, the Mamluk horses covering ground faster than the fleeing Mongol ponies, because Mamluk horses, shod and better fed, were not suffering the hoof damage that the rocky Syrian ground had inflicted on Mongol animals over weeks of campaigning. The pursuit was not simply about killing. It was about completing the message. An army that escapes a defeat can regroup. An army that is destroyed cannot. Kutuz understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent years thinking about what it would take not just to beat the Mongols once, but to establish permanently and unmistakably that the Mongols could be beaten. The retreat covered 8 miles. It ended at Bisan, where the remnant of Kitbuqa's force turned and attempted one last stand. A compressed defensive formation, men and horses exhausted, the injured mixed with the still capable, trying to summon one more engagement out of an army that had already given everything it had and found it insufficient. The Mamluks hit them again. The second battle of the day at Bisan was shorter than the first and significantly less complicated. The Mongol force was too depleted, too exhausted, and too psychologically broken to mount a coherent resistance. It collapsed in sections. The survivors, those who were still capable of fleeing after Bisan, scattered into the surrounding countryside, into the valleys and olive groves and rocky hillsides of Palestine. A significant number of them tried to hide in a reed bed near the battlefield. Kutuz ordered the reeds set on fire. The smoke rose in a single dark column into the clear September sky, visible for miles in every direction. It burned for a long time. When it was done, there was nothing left of the force that had been there. Nothing except ash and the smell that lingers after violence, the particular combination of burned grass and scorched iron that no amount of wind entirely removes. The valley was quiet. Birds returned to the spring at Ain Jalut. The water continued to flow, unaware of what had just happened above it. The army that had never been stopped had been stopped. And this time, unlike every other defeat the Mongols had absorbed and bounced back from, they would not return to avenge it. Not to Syria, not to Palestine, not to Egypt. The Mamluk Muslim forces defeated the Mongols in every subsequent engagement. At the Second Battle of Homs, at Elbistan, at Marj al-Safar. They never returned. The most feared military force in human history stood at the edge of a Galilean valley and found, for the first time, that the edge was not a beginning. It was an end. The dead were counted in ways that medieval armies counted dead, imprecisely, with approximations that served political as much as documentary purposes. What is clear from the sources is that the Mongol force left behind in Palestine by Hulagu was effectively destroyed as a fighting formation. The specific numbers that would satisfy a modern military historian are not recoverable from what survives. What the record does show, in the account of city after city that followed, is that the Mongol presence in Syria and Palestine evaporated within weeks. Damascus opened its gates to Mamluk forces almost immediately. Aleppo followed. The Syrian cities that had submitted to Mongol authority now simply changed masters, and the change produced nothing like the catastrophe that the initial Mongol conquest had. Kitbuqa had been right about one thing. Hulagu was enraged. But Hulagu could not act on his rage. He was 1,000 miles to the north, and between him and revenge stood a problem he had not anticipated. His cousin, Berk Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde, the westernmost Mongol Khanate, had converted to Islam. The deaths of Muslim soldiers and the destruction of Muslim cities in Hulagu's western campaign had been producing a slow deterioration of relations between the two branches of the Mongol family for years. Ain Jalut pushed it past the breaking point. In 1263, Berk launched a major military operation against Hulagu's forces in the Caucasus, the first open warfare between Mongol factions, and inflicted a serious defeat. Hulagu died in 1265, still planning his revenge against the Mamluks, still unable to execute it. He never got his second chance at the valley. The battlefield of Ain Jalut, in the weeks that followed the engagement, looked like all battlefields look after the living have moved on. Carrion birds. The particular stillness of places where large numbers of men have recently been moving very fast and are now not moving at all. Broken equipment scattered in patterns that tell the story of where the worst of the fighting had been. The concentrations of discarded weapons, the places where the soil was darker. The spring continued to flow. The water did not remember. Water never does. And then there was the matter of what happened on the road back to Cairo. Cutters rode south in the posture of a man who had just achieved something that almost no one had believed achievable 3 months earlier. He had killed the Mongol ambassadors when everyone told him it was suicide. He had marched north when everyone told him the Mongols were unstoppable. He had won. He was the Sultan of Egypt and the man who had saved the Islamic world. And the army behind him knew it. And the people waiting in Cairo would know it. And history would know it. He had perhaps 3 or 4 weeks of life remaining. The approach came during a hunting excursion. Baibars rode up alongside Qutuz and made a request. Reportedly, a captured Mongol girl, a small reward for the service rendered at Ain Jalut. Qutuz agreed. He reached out his hand in the gesture of granting the gift. Baibars took the hand and kissed it, a sign of gratitude, of loyalty, of submission. It was a signal. The men around them, Bari Mamluk officers, Baibars' people, positioned for exactly this moment, closed in. Cutters had no time to react. Baibars struck first. The Sultan of Egypt, the man who had refused to surrender to the Mongols when the whole world was surrendering, the man who had made the impossible choice that led to the impossible victory, died on a road in Palestine, with no more ceremony than a man who had outlived his usefulness to someone more ambitious. The army, presented with the fait accompli of a new sultan, accepted it. There was no uprising, no civil war, no period of instability. Baibars was strong, he was competent, he was the hero of Ain Jalut, the man who had designed the trap and sprung it and personally led the pursuit. The Mamluk military aristocracy, always pragmatic, looked at what Baibars offered and concluded that Qutuz was already dead and protest was therefore pointless. Baibars became the 4th Mamluk Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He would reign for 17 years. Under his rule, the Mamluks would expand their territory, rebuild what the Mongols had destroyed, and systematically dismantle the remaining Crusader presence in the Levant. He was brilliant, ruthless, visionary, and cruel in the specific way that men who have been owned and sold and survived everything tend to be. The cruelty of someone who has learned at an extremely young age that the world responds to strength and nothing else. He rebuilt the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo, giving it symbolic continuity without real authority. He expanded the Mamluk army from 10,000 cavalry to 40,000. He constructed a postal relay system across his empire that could transmit information from Cairo to Damascus in 4 days. He built hospitals and mosques and fortifications and warships. He was, by any measure, one of the most consequential rulers of the medieval world. None of it would have existed without the morning of September 3rd, 1260, and the decision Qutuz made that led to it. The decision that Qutuz did not survive to enjoy. The title of this video promises you a secret weapon, and now, standing on the other side of the story, it is time to tell you exactly what that weapon was, and why the answer is more complicated and more profound than a single piece of technology. Yes, there were the hand cannons. The Arabic manuscripts that survive from the decades after Ain Jalut describe portable firearms being used by the Mamluks in this battle. Metal tubes charged with explosive powder, capable of projecting a projectile and, more critically at that moment, producing a sound and a flash that the Mongol horses had never been conditioned to endure. The historian Ahmad Youssef al-Hassan argues these documents describe the first battlefield use of a true hand cannon in history. A claim that, if accepted, means that the first time a firearm changed the outcome of a battle, it did so not in Europe, but in a Palestinian valley. Not in the hands of European knights, but in the hands of former slaves from the Caucasus and the Black Sea steppe. 200 years before anyone even remembers to credit it. The debate among scholars about whether these were true firearms or sophisticated incendiary devices is real and unresolved. But the debate itself confirms that something unprecedented was deployed at Ain Jalut. Something that worked. Something that found its way into military memory as a decisive factor. Something that the Mongols, with all their experience of warfare across 3 continents, had never faced in quite that form before. But the hand cannon was the smallest of the secret weapons. Larger was the tactical brilliance of the feigned retreat, the supreme irony of a Mamluk army using the Mongol army's own signature tactic against it, in a valley specifically chosen to transform that tactic's usual advantage into a death trap. The Mongols won battles across Eurasia by inducing enemies to pursue a retreat and running them into ambushes. At Ain Jalut, Baibars inverted the formula with the precision of a man who understood the logic from the inside, because he came from the world the Mongols had created. Because his people had been victims of the same maneuver. Because nothing teaches you a weapon's mechanics like being hit by it. He did not just defend against the Mongol way of war, he weaponized it. Larger still was the geopolitical accident of Monk Khan's death. The timing that pulled Hulagu back with the bulk of his force, that left Kitbuqa in Palestine with a fraction of the army that had taken Baghdad, that gave the Mamluks a window of numerical parity they could never have achieved against Hulagu at full strength. History often turns on contingency, on the unpredictable removal of a key variable, on the death of a great Khan at precisely the wrong moment from the perspective of the empire he was building. But the largest secret weapon, the one the video title is actually pointing at, the one that makes this story mean something beyond military history, was the Mamluks themselves. The Mongol Empire conquered its way across Eurasia, and in doing so created a river of displaced, enslaved, and shattered people. Among them were tens of thousands of Turkic and Caucasian boys, sold into slave markets and purchased by the rulers of Egypt, trained in the most sophisticated martial system of the medieval Islamic world, forged into soldiers of extraordinary capability. The Mongol expansion made the Mamluk military system possible. The Mongols created the conditions by depopulating steppe regions, by flooding slave markets with Kipchak and Circassian children, by destroying alternative power structures that produced the specific kind of soldiers who stood in the Jezreel Valley on September 3rd, 1260. Baibars himself had been captured by Mongol raiders. His people had been shattered by Mongol expansion. He was a Mongol product, a weapon manufactured by the very machine he then turned around and destroyed. There is no metaphor adequate to this. It exceeds metaphor. It is simply what happened. The long-term consequences of Ain Jalut reach further than most people realize. The Mamluk Sultanate that the battle secured lasted for more than 2.5 centuries, until the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517. Under Baibars and his successors, it became the preeminent power of the medieval Middle East, driving the last Crusader states from the Levant, absorbing and eventually converting Mongol refugees, the Wafidiyya, former Mongol soldiers who joined Mamluk service after Ain Jalut, and providing the political and cultural continuity that preserved Islamic civilization through the most destructive period in its history. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol state in Persia that had been stopped at Ain Jalut, eventually converted to Islam by the late 13th century, a conversion that some historians trace partly to the psychological impact of their defeat at the hands of Muslims who refused to lose. The world the Ilkhanids built after conversion was a different world than the one they would have built if they had never been stopped in Palestine. Egypt remained Muslim. The Nile remained beyond Mongol reach. The corridor of civilization between Cairo and the Atlantic was not broken. And here is the question that makes serious historians pause. If the Mamluks had lost Ain Jalut, if Qutuz had surrendered, or if Baibars had designed a worse trap, or if the Syrian auxiliaries had stayed loyal to Kitbuqa, what then? The Mongols would have taken Egypt. North Africa lay open beyond it. The Mongols had already reached Poland from the east. A force in control of Egypt and North Africa, advancing west along the Mediterranean coast, with another Mongol army pressing from the north and east, would have caught Europe in a pincer that no combination of the fragmented, war-exhausted medieval European states could plausibly have resisted. Whether they would have pressed that advantage is unknowable. Whether the European Renaissance, which depended on the particular conditions of 14th and 15th century Mediterranean culture, trade, and the reintroduction of classical learning through Islamic scholarship, would have occurred under Mongol hegemony, is a question with no answer. What we can say is that the world the Renaissance produced, the world that produced everything that came after it, depended on a chain of contingencies that passed through a spring in Galilee on a September morning in 1260. Centuries later, the Jezreel Valley is still there. The site of Ain Jalut is inside Ma'ayan Harod National Park in modern Israel, a quiet, pleasant place, popular with hikers and families who come to picnic near the spring in the spring and summer months. There is no monument to the battle, no plaque that adequately captures what was decided there. The spring still flows, the water still cold and clear, still moving in the particular unhurried way of water that has been moving in the same place for thousands of years. The hills are still there, still covered in the same scrub brush that hid thousands of Mamluk soldiers on the night of September 2nd, 1260. If you walk the ridgeline in the early morning, when the valley fills with the same grey mist that filled it that September dawn, you can almost hear it. The drums, the hoofbeats, the sound that was unlike anything the Mongol horses had ever heard before. The world you live in today was decided in a valley most people have never heard of, by a man who had been bought and sold as a boy, using tactics learned from the enemies who had enslaved him, armed with a weapon that history almost forgot. The Mongols created Baibars. Baibars destroyed the Mongols. And in the end, that is the only secret weapon that has ever truly mattered. The one your enemy makes for you, without knowing what they are building, without understanding what it will become, without any warning at all, until the morning the valley fills with fire, and the world changes, and there is nothing left to do except understand, too late, what they have done.